The crime is the confession. The act of having conducted the violation is the admission to criminal intent from the various angles, which generates the trajectory of criminal motive for the insurrectionists. At which point, when the Confederate double agents of the intelligence and other communities engage in blocking of key evidence in order to prevent the public from knowing crucial pieces of information, then that, as a contempt for government and sedition, facilitates the mechanism of proving their guilt. At which point, if they had simply not been guilty, then the subject would not be significant, generating the obligation for the full correction at the discarding and throwing out of all poison materials tampered with, which is evidenced by participants who are engaged in these violations as partial, and the engagement of the use of the partial who are actively manipulating the information facilitates the disqualified piece, which throws out the subject of law in the courts, which disqualifies the court from happening, which goes to the victim or the target instead of the aggressors from the government. So when the state is trying to go after them, if the state uses contaminated information under reasonable doubt, you have to throw out the state. So their false claim of protecting sources and methods is actually subversive to the objective of law, as their entire arrangement is that they're engaged in KKK contracts without a remedy to a secret, which means that they are actively polluting the information, which means they cannot be taken seriously in the American court structure, which means there are no legal functions of the government when it uses them as agents. At which points you have to discard and make the full correction against the polluted arrangements, and then begin to investigate their arrest and prosecution and due diligence of removing the infection from the system, at which point you have to prep the United States for the surgery, uh, removing the parasite of the white nationalists, at which point the KKK being removed from the United States government facilitates the series of their recoveries which are necessary for the enforcement of the policies which are essential to the rule of law stabilizing for a full recovery on maturity. The cons which they are actively distributing are an extension of the con which tricked them, which is the deceit that a unprofessional force can be considered to an advantage, as there are trade-offs. In life, there are no advantages or disadvantages. There's only trade-offs. There isn't better or worse. There's only trading off the liability. At which point, their use of crime as a trade-off for liability is degrading back into historic unprofessional military functions, which generate catastrophic errors which had to be corrected by the refining of history into competence out of whatever the fuck they are. At which point, their insanity is doing what they know will fail in order to take the advantages derived by historic injuries because of their criminal intent. Now, their Satanist loyalties to the rejection of God for the function of not condemning him as not being the good, but rather their own self importance, the identity of their capacity to engage in tyranny, their own self validation to the infinite evils which compels evil onto others and will not tolerate the good, at which point good becomes evil and evil becomes good because the maniacs are in charge. And when the lunatics run the asylum, you have a fool of a king. And thus, you have the systematic collapse of the entire arrangements of their structure in society, which generates the position that they are a suicide cult. and the act of self-destruction as the primary goal of their overarching theory is a subversion through the protocols of the learned elders of Zion, which has at it the top objective of systematically fooling these spineless anti-masculine faggots to engage in their Nazi arrangements as their pursuit for these criminal damages in favor of criminal profits historically viewed as inferior and incompetent in the structure of a stable system facilitates the acknowledgement that they are the sucker in their own con, and as the intolerable buffoon that they are greedily desperate for the mechanisms of their own demise. All of their systems are fraud, and every single mechanism which promotes them under their Ponzi schemes arranges for the mechanism to collapse the total structure into abject misery, at which point their agreement is that the human race is the enemy, and thus some other nonsense or bullshit for whatever interest they're actually going for is rather insignificant, such as the distraction of pursuing Gaia. Without humans, you have the restoration of the world, which recovers in our absence. At which point, these types of assumptions are actively engaged at the top tier of the cult. The lower level members of the cult are actively told one thing, and then once you get to the top, it inverts to the exact opposite. At which point, the unprofessional military inside the United States, which took over from the military industrial educational complex after World War II into the unproductive, unprofessional mechanism, systematically engaged in the compounding errors of the hierarchy as a staged function of the KKK wizard arrangements, which, as a compounding function of the Nazis in the FBI trying to overthrow the government, is a system of corruption by those Nazis who are an extension or a specific phantom cell experiment of the Confederacy in order to collapse the United States as destroying America with the function of the Confederacy is the objective. And since they're not planning on changing any of their policies, the way that they're going to destroy the United States is the thing that they will kill themselves with, thus making it a suicide pact. Their criminal arrangements, such as their black market functions, is the primary resource which they derive importance from, which generates their assertion of status in their various forms of the practice of the ritual occult mechanism, which facilitates their actual functioning society as they are religious radicals, extremists, loyal to death. And their engagement to this system facilitates the systematic errors which are observed in the general public, such as unitary executive theory used in order to compel wars not approved of by Congress. So the overthrowing of the rule of law by the mechanism of the presidency without the office, which is the mechanism of a double agent, which is insurrection, which is not legal. The usurpation of powers, specifically being barred, requires the mechanism of national security in order to oppose adequately, as the office of the presidency is the thing with the authority, and the president that does not faithfully uphold the mechanism of the office is not serving in the office, is a terrorist insurgent without a legal government. And the terrorist insurgent without a legal government has no authorities of government which they are not serving. It is historically understood that America's greatest weaknesses are not from without, but within. The act of being able to be infiltrated by the enemy who compromises the system by its corruption is the greatest weakness, requiring the rule of law to conquer and stabilize. In masculinity, the function of sorting out the honest hierarchy by the meritocracy requires a non-cheating contest, at which point the act of violating the basic rules to the extradimensional function is a subversion against the hierarchy, is the contempt against the masculinity exchange, is the function of choosing the effeminate subversion, at which point the function of the toxic femininity is the act of using the cheats in order to subsequently change the results to the predetermined answer from the predetermined verdict that they have in their heads in favor of their strategic military operations of using uh, lawfare as an aspect of espionage war in order to systematically purge their superiors in the hierarchy, at which point you have the mechanism of toxic femininity as their baseline, which generates the function of their general destruction of their own interests. At which point, the hyper investment into the super secret, hyper technical tools in order to tell them base reality can only tell them the thing that they specifically don't want to hear, which is the reality that they are rebelling against. And the reality that they're rebelling against as their hyper opposition to masculinity in reality generates the mechanism for the destruction, at which points they are and have always been a suicide. These Nazi bastards are using toxic femininity. They are effeminate losers who can't make it or function in the real world. At which point their subversion is their core identity. The handicap, which subsidizes their inferiority, is their core social identity. So if Confederate leadership in the double agents of their military function conducts an operation and does a bunch of mistakes and reports it to those who have to be taken seriously, they say the exact opposite of the thing that they intend. And the being unreliable as their core mechanism is infinitely reproduced from their core identity. So if you are someone who has to take themselves seriously, uh, to create any form of self-respect or sense of masculinity to any substantial way for any progress to any positive outcome, you're going to have to reaffirm David back to the original branch of intelligence oversight using the military police function, such as is essential to investigate and dismantle the insurrectionist Confederacy who are systematically destroying the country as a double agent, acting in contempt of the legal government in favor of the deep state Confederacy, which is nothing more than the KKK's secret empire. Everyone who joins the government has to swear an oath of loyalty to the rule of law, to the constitutional republic, at which point, whenever they act outside of that office, they are acting as an individual and not as the office, which is essential to understand the essential nature to prosecute and remove those terrorists. At which point, the double agents being purged requires the restoration of the things they were committing sedition by, such as the restraint of David Bowles as general in his branch of the military of intelligence oversight, which is essential to the function of the military police officers who are engaging in the mechanism of stopping the threats by the insurgency, at which point the invisible empire rating David as the highest threat has engaged in the most dirty tricks, terrorism, subversions that they can without giving up their black market contracts, such as to the Satanist cultists trying to create the Antichrist by ritual, child sacrifice, which is what David is. He was a mechanism of a breeding program to an indigo child, having been discovered to be the thing, was then set up for the child sacrifice ritual of the highest value, at the most diverse mechanisms projected which they were breeding for, including the function of wealth from the title of the Legend of David Company, which was being obstructed by through the subverting of the targeted communities, preventing them from doing reasonable precautions from them, at which point their use of double agents subverting those communities were actively saying that they were trying to protect themselves from the government, which is not objectively true. A double agent is acting as an individual and not as their office. So they were not protecting themselves against the government, they were protecting themselves against insurrectionists. And the function requires them to have tried to have done necessary precautions in order to protect themselves from the threat, which are the insurrectionists from the Invisible Empire. So, for instance, after the studies of Japan from World War II, amongst the other mechanisms, they would have actively upgraded the mechanism for the insurance market, which would have already existed in that function, which generates the ability to engage in nailless building technology as a base structure before the defenses start. So you would have like concrete in order to stop bullets, but the concrete requires the active mechanism of the structure from a wood arrangement, which could be dismantled um, from the Japanese technique of cutting wood specifically into a jigsaw puzzle, which allows them to actively move it, at which point you have the shell outside and you have the puzzle inside, which is for the actual living conditions, and the mobile nature of these tent permanent buildings generates the normalization of the ability to flee from danger when the invisible empire sends its lynch mob, such as the terrorist extortions of no remedy to a secret by the mechanism of uh, using fake assertions of government in order to have Confederate kangaroo courts not protect the public's rights against the terrorist attacks, as the double agent judges, disloyal, are not going to provide an equitable or a legal opinion, as they are a fraudulent court who has contempt for the office. It is essential to understand that no one is above the law in the nation of law. It is the rule of law, not the rule of the bureaucrat. The rule of the bureaucrat is the rule of the wizard, and the rule of the wizard is the rule that has systematically been condemned throughout history and in Christianity in the Bible. At which point, the position of the Empire of China when it was collapsing was dividing the rule of the bureaucrat, which is the maximizing of corruption in order to defraud the humans. At which point you have the system of the collapsing arrangement, which is the pact to fail. And the pact to fail is not a legal function of the government. So if they use their fraudulent excuses, such as secrets, in order to cover for their criminal actions against the national interest. They are a threat to national security, requiring military retaliation. Criminals do not respect laws. Felons do not respect laws. What is the liberal problem by conservatives? That they think that gun-free zones are going to stop criminals from bringing in guns. Well, it doesn't really work out because they're already a criminal and they're already committing crimes. They already come to commit a crime, so committing more crimes doesn't really mean anything. It's not a deterrent. And as that is base reality, those who vote, such as with J. Sekulow Civil War, to overthrow or coerce other jurisdictions into compliance is the policy of treason, or war against the United States and its various jurisdictions, for the compulsion of voter fraud and subjugation as an enemy of war, to the American by a separatist, at which point they are felon traitors engaged in treason, sedition, and high crimes as a terrorist insurgent or a Confederate double agent or separatist, at which point they're a felon who do not have the authority to any American role, such as a member of the police force or, I don't know, receive Social Security benefits or the right to carry weapons. At which point, the same problem that you would have arguing to not put them to death is the same problem conservatives have with the liberals. They're not going to respect the rules. Their core identity is anarchist, separatist, insurrectionist, violator, ripper, robber, spoiler, traitor. You cannot trust those morons to live. You can, however, arrest them and have them executed as the public threat that they are. That is the position of the United States military from the president, that all who support terrorists are an enemy of war to the United States. And these policies, conceptually put together, demand those particular outcomes, unless you're one of those namby-pamby liberals who believes that a gun-free zone sign is going to stop a shooter. Then your answer is kill everyone who supported those policies. And if you are one of those namby-pamby liberals who don't want to kill the public threats who want to murder and rape your children, then you have to become a conservative in order to competently secure against the threat that you're unwilling to solve, creating the alternative function, at which point you have an obligation conceptually for the Confederate state to be formed where they can be overwhelmingly subdued as the threat that they are, under the contracted security state of the Confederacy, to be subject to their own customs, separate to all human beings with the soul, or have any redeeming quality or connection to the God of the Bible, who is their immortal adversary. At which point you understand that the obligation to solve the threat requires the oxymoron to exist, at which point anyone who is viable to approve of that direction is, in fact, by definition, contradicting themselves. And while I'm not going to argue with them over the merits of their self-contradictions, I will acknowledge the facts of what needs to happen at a minimum to tolerate their position as non-treasonous by becoming grossly negligent. On a lighter note, you may understand the complexities of what this symbolizes, which is the entirety of what we have been discussing in previous. Thus, one could, in their imagination, put at the context of the entirety of their life the summary of the acquiring of power for its own sake, and in the acquiring of their own power at the end of their life, and the burning from the aftermath, the dross that is the excesses of the injury against the whole, the retributions against the reality from reality, compounding against them, for their own fate is sealed by their own incompetence. One must assume that there was one ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them. The Satanist trap is alluring to many. Unearned profits are desirable to all. But for those who are willing to make the deal with the devil, who have bargained the Faustian deal, will find at the end of the day they were the sucker in their own cause.